So what we thought we'd do for this session is we are going to answer some questions. Mark is going to take most of them, and I'm going to take one of them. And you guys ask questions as we go along as well. So can you throw up the first question, Stephen? All right, what is God's view of the mind? So the first session we thought we'd do the mind of Christ. And so what's God's view of the mind?
I hope you guys find this interesting. I find this stuff immensely interesting. And that can be a problem because I find it so interesting that I forget that other people may find it a little bit dry and it gets boring, so I'm going to try to keep it as fun as I can. I want you guys to know that I don't believe Christianity to be true because I'm a Christian, okay? I'm a Christian because I believe Christianity to be true. Do you guys see the difference there? I want to start with a quote by C.S. Lewis, and Dan, I will try not to rely on the notes. I have so much stuff I want to do. If you see me doing that, no, this isn't all that though. This is okay, it's not all that. So grab me and pull me. I'll get excited, okay? So it's a C.S. Lewis quote. To be ignorant and simple now, not to be able to meet the enemy on his own ground, would be to throw down our weapons and betray our uneducated brethren who, under God, have no defense but us against the intellectual heathen. Good philosophy must exist, if for no other reason, because bad philosophy needs to be answered. Another quote by G.K. Chesterton, the point of having an open mind is like having an open mouth. It's to close it on something solid. All right? G.K. Chesterton. I believe we live in one of the most anti-intellectual times in the history of the church. R.C. Sproul, have you guys ever heard of R.C. Sproul, the Christian apologist? He thinks that we live in what could be the most anti-intellectual time in the church. Like, I mean, I don't know what your churches are like, but there's a lot of evangelical places of worship where if you were going in there and struggling with some intellectual things, like things I did, like, boy, can I really believe the Bible? Is the Bible really true? Or, boy, somebody told me the other day, something about the creation of the universe, and it's really sort of put me, thrown me for a loop. Can you help me with that? There's a lot of churches right now where there actually be no members of the congregation that could help you with that stuff. How did it get to be that way? I'm not so sure. But one of the things is that the church simply could be following the way of North American culture in general. Have you guys ever listened to CBC on weekends? There's a show called The Age of Persuasion. Have you heard of that? Yeah, you've heard. So it's hosted, it's about the advertising industry. It's hosted by a guy called Terry O'Reilly, all right? And it's a fun show because it's all about sort of why people buy things and how the advertising industry works. And one of the things that he hammers home every single show is that advertisers realized a long time ago that the way to get people to buy your products is not to argue logically on behalf of the product. All right? It's to present almost a lifestyle, a feel, an emotion. You know what I mean? Because the advertisers realize that people out there just simply aren't interested in thinking critically anymore. Like you were saying in medical school. And the way to do it is present a feeling, and people will buy the product based on that. Like we live in a world, let's face it, guys, where you stand a greater chance of having an impact on African politics and development by being a rock and roll star. All right, than actually studying African politics or development, or by being somebody who has a vested interest in African politics and development, namely Africans. Do you see what I mean? I think that says a lot about the world. Sorry, Dave?
Back to the question.
Yeah, so just the other day, it's okay, yeah, that's true, I'm getting excited, Dan. All right. Just the only one more story. Just the other. No, I won't tell a story, Dan. Thanks for bringing me back.
There.
All right.
So you're leading us into topic 3.
I know. So I think Christianity has speaks very fondly of the mind, and I want you to know that this isn't just academia that we're going to talk about. All right. It really isn't. Like at the end of the day, I guess the proof of that is it's my story. I don't have a really exciting testimony where God brought me to the depths of despair and then revealed something to me. My story of how I became a Christian is actually a very pedestrian thing of thought exercises and working through difficulties that I had, and one day I found myself on my knees. All right? It's not very exciting to talk about, but it's mine. I did come through Christ with the mind. And it's not just academic. I really don't think it is. Look at all the major things that have happened in the world, like how we feel about homosexuality or abortion or whatever. Those things started in academia, guys. Go way back, go 15, 20 years ago, and you'll see people were writing about that in psychology journals and stuff like that. I have this quote by Viktor Frankl I want to read you. Philosopher, if we present man with a concept of man which is not true, we may well corrupt him. When we present him as an automaton of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drive and reactions, as a mere product of heredity and the environment, we feed the nihilism to which modern man is in any case prone. I became acquainted with the last stage of corruption in my second concentration camp, Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and environment, or as the Nazis like to say, of blood and soil. I am absolutely convinced that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were ultimately prepared not in some ministry or the other in Berlin, but rather at the desks and in the lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers. Viktor Frankl. 1 Peter 3:15 to answer Dan's question. We read that. But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone for the faith that is within you, but do so with gentleness and respect. And gentleness and respect are key, all right? As they say, it's no point cutting off somebody's nose and giving them a rose to smell, all right? So do this with gentleness and respect. Has somebody ever, by giving them an answer, come to Christ? I don't know. Maybe they have. I've certainly engaged a lot of people in discussions, and no one's ever said, "Oh, Mark, you're absolutely right. Where's the church?" You know what I mean? However, though, I will tell you this, that I have had several occasions where after engaging somebody, say in medical school, a couple of people who were listening in, all right, that person who you weren't talking to came and said, "Geez, Mark, thanks so much. I was struggling with that. And I'm glad you were able to answer that question." So not just academia. Romans 12:1-2 has more evidence. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, and I think this is, if I could summarize Paul's intellectual message or worship and intellectual message in one part of the Bible, it's Romans 12. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, okay? Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. Our God actually wants us to test His truth. That's an amazing thing. We don't have to just take it for granted. He wants us to test it. And later we'll talk about what I think it means to renew your mind, because I think that's key. Isaiah 1:18. Come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins are as scarlet, I certainly know mine are, they will be as white as snow. They are red like crimson, they will be like wool. The God of the universe not only wants you to test His truth, but He wants you to reason with Him. I love how Jesus reasoned. Like, He was a Socratic teacher, and when people asked Him a question, He'd answer it back, like the rich young ruler, "Good master, what must I do to achieve everlasting life?" What does Jesus say? "Why do you call me good?" I love that. Why do you call me good? There is none good but God. Are you calling me God? I love how He did that. Should we pay taxes? Whose image do you see here? In many ways, the unasked question by Jesus there is, whose image is on you, right? I love how Jesus reasoned with his disciples. Christianity challenges the intellectual establishment, I think, not by denying the intellect, all right, but by presenting its ideas in the public square, like Christ did, like Paul did, and letting the ideas float in the meritocracy of ideas. Do you see what I mean? Not by denying the intellect, but allowing the ideas to be tested and shown to be true. Just like Paul at the Areopagus in Greece, that's essentially like Paul going to the Supreme Court, you know what I mean, and arguing on behalf of Christian ideas. He did that. Like in Acts 17:1. This is in Thessalonica, but we read that. When Paul and his companions had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, and you did a fantastic job in trying to pronounce those things, by the way. They came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As was his custom, Paul went into the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I am proclaiming to you as the Messiah, he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and quite a number of prominent women. Even John's gospel, how does he start it? Right? He could have started it with, in the beginning was God, and that would have been true. He could also have started it with, in the beginning was love, and that would have been perfectly true. But he starts it with, in the beginning was the Word. The Word, concept, reason, logic. I love the way that he started that gospel. So in Dan, I think the mind is very, very important in the Christian walk.
Cool. Next question. How does the mind shape belief? Have we covered that off?
Let me do a little bit there.
Certainly.
But again, yank me away.
All right.
Okay, so I'm sorry about moving too quickly. I'll move fast. People asked G.K. Chesterton, a journalist, or an author, I should say, why he was a Christian. And he told them there's 1,000 reasons why I'm a Christian, but it all really boils down to one reason, which is why I believe Christianity to be the truth. You know what I mean? I think it's important to know that when you ask someone to accept Christ, you're not asking them to believe a lie. You're asking them to believe the truth. Like the Bible there, like I'm telling you guys right now, if that's not the truth, don't believe it, all right? Don't believe the Bible if it's not true. But the beauty of it is that I think that it is, all right? In fact, I know that it is. John 18:37. You were a king then, said Pilate. Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world was to do what? Was to seek and save his lost? Nope. That's good. That would have been most correct. To testify to the truth. All right? Anyone who is on the side of truth listens to me. Like I said, if the Bible isn't true, don't believe it, but Jesus says it is. Matthew 22:37-40. Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. You notice how that's Jesus stating the first commandment again from the Old Testament, right? Do you guys know the difference? You guys notice the difference between the way Jesus states it and how it's stated in the Old Testament? In the Old Testament, it is, thou shalt love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. All right? Jesus adds mind. All right? I've always sort of wondered that. I think, Dan, and you probably know more about this than me, that it has to do with the concepts of, like, the whole point of that passage, of course, is to love God with everything that you have. All right? That's the whole point of that. And to the Hebrews, that was conveyed with heart, soul, and strength. In many ways, they sort of had one seat of knowledge. They called it the heart. Right? They could have called it foot, you know what I mean? But they called it heart, but it was one seat of knowledge. To convey that same idea to a Greek audience, all right, Jesus added the term mind, right? You know, and I hear that a lot, like stuff in evangelical churches about mind-heart duality, all right? And you'll hear things like, you know, that's head knowledge, but it's not heart knowledge, you know what I mean? To be honest with you, to this day, I don't quite know what it means, all right? My best guess is that when people say that, by head knowledge they mean an insincere knowledge, all right? And by heart knowledge they mean real knowledge, all right? And in that case, I'm not going to stand here and argue on behalf of insincere knowledge, right? Who would ever want that? Like, personally, I know, maybe my understanding of my personal knowledge is probably more Hebrew. I have one seat of knowledge. If I have 2, I can tell you guys this for sure, that my heart will stop believing pretty fast what my mind knows isn't true. All right, I'll level with you, all right? So maybe I'm more Hebrew in my understanding of knowledge. He also says here to love your God with your mind. And Dan, I really want to touch on that later. I want to say just a couple, I want to make sure people don't say I'm downplaying feelings. I think feelings and emotions are really important, and I think you'd be a fool to completely ignore them. I really would. But you have to be careful because feelings will lead you around by the nose. I know certainly mine will. As soon as I wake up in the morning, my feelings are talking to me, Dan. Mark, you're tired. Why do you want to go to work? You're not doing any good there. Honest to goodness. You guys heard of Oswald Chambers, my utmost for his highest? He says this, there are certain things we must not pray about. Moods, for instance. Moods never go by praying, moods go by kicking. A mood nearly always has its seat in the physical condition, not in the moral. It is a continual effort not to listen to the moods which arise from a physical condition. Never submit to them for a second. We have to take ourselves by the scruff of the neck and shake ourselves We will find that we can do what we said we could not. The curse with most of us is that we won't. The Christian life is one of incarnate spiritual pluck. It's one last thing. Because feelings are so important, I just want to say, never underestimate the power of the arts and the media. All right? You guys have watched a movie and listened to shows and stuff like that. The next thing you know, you launch headlong into something without thinking it through. That's the power of that. All right? The media and the arts and have the capacity to bypass the intellect and go directly to the will. All right? I'm telling you guys, a lie that you pick up in 10 seconds of a movie, or a friend does by reading a couple of pages of Da Vinci Code, because they're into the characters and stuff like that, can take hours of reasoning with them to undo that. Even though it's not even presented very accurately, but it's presented in the emotional context. Okay? So be careful. Emotions are powerful, so certainly don't ignore them. Dan, sorry.
So what we thought we would do next is get into a couple of the mental maps, if you will, also called worldviews, that you will find dominate in the people that you interact with. And Mark was going to take one of them, and I'm going to take the other one.
Do you want to go first, or should I go first? There's modern, and we want to talk about two major
Well, modernity should go first, because it came first, yes.
All right, okay.
Modernity,
So,
Stephen, next one.
Okay. So modernism, guys, and I'm going to try to do this, I'm going to try to keep this as not dry as I possibly can, all right? There was a time, come on, Mark, you can do this, all right. Okay. There was a time between the Middle Ages, all right, and what we call the modern era, called the Renaissance. You guys have heard that, right? The Renaissance spanned many hundreds of years, all right? And it was a period of slow reform of knowledge and education, all right, that eventually culminated in a period called the Enlightenment, all right? So Renaissance to the Enlightenment. Enlightenment was the age of reason, okay? And it was during the Enlightenment, here, I'll tell you, Enlightenment thinkers, all right, essentially believed in three things, all right? They were an objective, and I have to say this, or else you won't understand modernism and postmodernism. Okay, guys, sorry about this. So Enlightenment thinkers essentially believed three things. Number one, an objective body of knowledge exists and is waiting to be discovered. Number two, this knowledge is neutral and value-free. And number three, the pursuit of this knowledge will benefit all of mankind, right? In many ways, those are the pillars of the Enlightenment period. As you can see, it was a very optimistic time of knowledge. And in this time, to be honest with you, what we now consider modern-day scientists grew out of the Enlightenment. I mean, for the first time, Western civilizations were able to surpass for example, the engineering and astronomical wonders of the ancient world. All right, like the Aztecs and the Egyptians and stuff like that. Classic Enlightenment thinkers would be Francis Bacon and René Descartes. All right. After that, nearing the end of the Enlightenment period, some pretty bad things happened. Some disastrous revolutions in Europe. All right, and of course the First World War. All right, and that sort of brought that whole optimism crushing down. All right, and it is from that in many ways the sort of when we refer to as the modern period began, which is in many ways Enlightenment thinking minus the optimism, all right? Because they see how many bad things can happen despite the fact that we're living in the Enlightenment period, all right? Now, will you have somebody in your medical school say, hey, I'm a modernist and these are my modernist ideas? No. How it's commonly encountered now is through a worldview that I'll give the correct name for it is scientific naturalism, all right? But the people in your class will call themselves atheists, all right? That is sort of and it's really popular right now. And from now on, I'll just use the term atheism to refer to modernism, because then you'll have the better mind picture of what it is, all right? Really popular now, like who are the major authors? You know what I mean? Like Richard Dawkins, heard of Richard Dawkins? What book did he write? The God Delusion, all right? I don't have it with me, but I have a book here called The Dawkins Delusion that you should definitely read, all right? I have, who else? The other guy? Who's the guy that makes Richard Dawkins look tame? This guy will come around and make you cry. He'll call Christians stupid. What's his name? Dr. Phil. Christopher Hitchens, all right? He wrote the book God is Not Great. All right, I don't know if you guys have read these. Might be worth a read, and it goes on and on. I have this review that and these books, I got to be honest with you guys, like read Richard Dawkins, you'll realize it's not a great argument. All right, they're old arguments that are rehashed badly. all right? But it's worth reading because that's what the people out there who are atheists in your class are reading. So it's worth knowing what they're reading. I have this great review that was written about Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. Let me just read you the first paragraph. And this guy's critiquing Dawkins' book. Imagine someone holding forth on biology whose only knowledge of the subject is the Book of British Birds, and you have a rough idea of what it feels like to read Richard Dawkins on theology. Card-carrying rationalists like Dawkins, who is the nearest thing to a professional atheist we have had since Bertrand Russell, are in one sense the least well-equipped to understand what they castigate, since they don't believe there is anything there to be understood, or at least worth understanding. Like, for example, people like Richard Dawkins wouldn't even bother to learn about Christianity before they critique it, because they think that that's essentially like critiquing somebody and having a rational discourse with somebody who believes in the tooth fairy. Do you see what I mean? Like if you're trying to talk to, you don't go and you research all the different concepts of the tooth fairy. Do you know what I mean? That's literally how the new atheists think about the religious movements. All right? So you'll hear that's modernism in many ways atheism. Carl Sagan, the classic, what did he say? The cosmos is all there ever was, is, and will be. Right? Carl Sagan. Remember they wrote the book Cosmos and had the TV show? All right? So the classic scientific naturalism or atheism is essentially this, that the only things that are real are the material world, the material universe. There is no supernatural. That's why it's called scientific naturalism, all right? Atheism is, of course, part of that. All that is real is the natural world, and all that we can ever know is the natural world, all right? And that's how you'll encounter that in your class from atheists, all right? So that in a nutshell is modernism, all right? I will critique modernism later. Do you want to just tell people about postmodernism?
So I got a few quotes to read through. And so, as Mark has already alluded to...
And this is weird, by the way, because I'm normally the postmodern guy.
Usually, yes.
You know, so we've sort of switched it up, so this is really interesting.
So you will encounter, some of your classmates you will encounter will be into modernity. The physical world is all there is. All they are is living, breathing machines. Right. All you need to do to change the world is understand the machinery and apply forces in the right directions, apply the right chemicals to the human machine, and you fix the problems. And if you are truly an enlightened thinker, you would believe that that was true not only of the physical body, but of all of the social problems. So how do we solve racism? How do we solve poverty? How do we solve any problem you can think of? They would say, well, one needs to apply a rational approach, understand the working of the machine, construct a perfect picture of the machine, and then manipulate the machine. Because all there is the machines. We are all simply machines. So, postmodernity is where you'll find most of the thinkers you encounter of your generation. It's interesting that postmodernity is already almost gone, and Stephen's generation is thinking even differently than this, and we can get into that afterwards if you're interested. And there's huge debate. Modernity is definitely a well-established rational worldview. It's a thing. A huge debate in the literature about whether postmodernity is a thing or not. Is it an intellectual movement or just a fad? Is it something distinct from modernity, or is it modernity looking at itself? And so it gets really convoluted, so I won't be nearly as flowing as Mark was, because postmodernity is a mess. Anyways, postmodernity is the situation in which the world finds itself after the collapse of the Enlightenment project, which lasted from the latter part of the 18th century until well into the 20th. That project, whose goal was for the world's diverse peoples to see things in the same rational way, is now questioned. What was secure, foundational, and established is now called into question. The assertion now is that our modern perception of the way things are, rather than being knowledge based on reason and empirical evidence, is instead merely a set of self-serving ideologies constructed by those in power, ideologies that marginalize those who disagree. And you have to understand that this came about because of what happened at the beginning of the 19th century. This happened because of things like World War I. With the Great War, things began to go badly wrong. Until then, smart people, mostly Christian thinkers included, believed in the inevitability of progress. The world and they in the world were getting better every day in every way. Then came the guns of August 1914, and it was announced that the lights were going out all over the world. This presumably enlightened century had loosed more rivers of blood and piled up more mountains of corpses than any century in history. The victims of Stalin and Hitler, and of Mayo, who killed more than both combined, are calculated to be somewhere around 200 million, give or take 10 or 20 million. We lost count along the way. And of course, victors do not usually count all the firestorms, both atomic and conventional, of Hamburg and Dresden, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So we come into the 19th century thinking we've got enlightenment, we've got science, we're getting better, and probably the most rational, most modern country on the planet, Germany, creates the Holocaust. And already at the turn of the century, some of the philosophers were starting to get a little disenchanted with modernity. Nietzsche and some of those thinkers were starting to say, wait a moment, I don't think this is working out. In 1946, when the world realizes what has just happened for the last 30 years, the entire planet says, wait a moment, this was not how reason was supposed to turn out. Maybe there's something to treating us as no more than machines that's gone horribly wrong. Because of course, if we're all just machines and the machine is broken and not fixable, then you just turn it off. All right? And that led to horrendous things. A few other things that happened. There was a look for deeper meaning. Scientific rationality had given us artificial abstractions and material aplenty, but also psychological, social, and spiritual poverty. We had more and more knowledge, but less and less meaning in life. So people were saying, well, surely there's something more. You can't explain love and God and culture and art if we're all just machines. The other thing that was happening was other cultures were starting to be deeply understood. So when the Enlightenment thinkers went out and encountered other cultures, well, obviously they were primitive cultures, and you just needed to make them scientific and rational, and their cultures needed to be done away with and replaced by British culture. That was the main culture, because British culture was the height of truth and reason. And then, of course, as people actually lived in these cultures and came to understand them, they said, wait a moment, these people aren't stupid. These people aren't illogical. These people aren't irrational. They just seem to be differently intellectual, and they have a different logic. And these cultures make sense, and maybe our culture is not so dominant. Interestingly, modernity had said that the only way to understand anything is to study it rationally. So then some, upstarts started to say, okay, well, let's take the lens of modernity and turn it on modernity. Let's start understanding how scientists reach conclusions. And all of a sudden, it didn't work out so well. And also, modernity said very little about ethics and the purpose of knowledge, right? The classic example is the atomic weapon, right? Modernity gave us the atomic weapon, but didn't tell us what to do with the atomic weapon. And if it's 1952, you need to start to understand, okay, maybe we need systems of thinking that give us a little more than these weapons. Maybe we need systems of thinking that tell us what we should be doing and not doing with these weapons, because we've done some pretty awful things with these weapons, and we now have reached the point where we actually could wipe ourselves out as a species. And what got us there? Modernity. Thanks, modernity. All right, so what does post-modernity believe? Interesting, post-modernity believes a lot of stuff. One, it believes that all knowledge is constructed and self-serving. So there's no absolute bank of knowledge out there. There's just a bunch of us going out looking around and finding things that help us maintain power. Every claim to truth and authority falls under suspicion. So a postmodern person, the thing that will get their back up is the moment you claim to actually have knowledge. They won't like that. There is a distrust of reason, right? What did reason get us? Reason got us Auschwitz. There's a rejection of grand narratives. We all have narratives, we all have stories, we all have understandings. They're all equally valid. All voices must be heard. And the more dominant and the more absolute a narrative claims to be, the less it is trusted, right? What are the outcomes? Well, there's some good outcomes, like democracy, right? Democracy flows out of the idea that everyone's voice matters. Everyone has an opinion, and everyone's voice matters. Of course, democracy as it is now in the US, and to a degree in Canada, is that you have to pander to every voice, because every voice matters, and there's nothing else to do. There's powerful deconstruction. So you will find if you study in philosophy departments, in sociology departments, it's all about deconstructing. Taking something and taking it apart and understanding the motivations behind it, and a little bit like understanding humanity by only spending time in an anatomy lab. There is a focus on power. No, they really do care about power and who's wielding power. 227, so let me get there. So here's a quote on skepticism. Modernity was built on skepticism towards traditional knowledge. Postmodernity was built on skepticism towards modernity. 27. If all knowledge was constructed by groups motivated by self-interest, then, as Paul Ricoeur notes in his Hermeneutics of Suspicion, we must ask of every ideology what privileges the supporting community gains by insisting on it. You go out there and promote a truth, the first thing that the postmodern person is going to ask is, what's your game? What are you after? What do you hope to gain by this? Every claim to truth is immediately placed under suspicion. Knowledge becomes no longer an issue of truth, but one of power and control. Right? And whenever we are using our truths to exercise power and control in society, we feed this, which is something we need to be very careful of. There is a blurring of lines between info and entertainment. Right? In politics, in culture, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV, and therefore I'm a valid person to tell you what pain reliever to buy. And apparently that actor, received thousands of letters during his lifetime asking for medical advice.
Who is this guy?
Have you ever seen so this is a 1970s thing. I think it was a soap opera character that played a doctor. Some pain reliever had him as their spokesperson, and he started the commercial with, I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV. And then launched into telling you why this particular pain reliever or antacid or whatever was the one you should buy. And this guy got lots, because again, there's no absolute truth. I mean, what makes a doctor? Well, yeah, I've got what makes a doctor, but you've got what makes a doctor, and he's decided that he plays one on TV, and because TV's real, because this is not any more real than anything else, he's also a doctor, so you write and ask him about things. He got thousands of letters during his lifetime asking for medical advice. Relativism becomes huge. So how does this work out in politics? Abandoning the idea of moral truth, politics is no longer the deliberation of how we ought to order our life together, but is, in the phrase of Alistair McKintrey, warfare carried on by other means. All politics is combat politics. There is no longer, some say, a common American culture, so we should stop pretending that there is. There are only subcultures. Choose your subculture, take up its grievances, contentions, and slogans, and prepare to do battle against the enemy. We are urged to recognize the futility of being locked in civil argument and accept the fact that there is no substitute for partisan victory. Many postmodernists deny the possibility of knowing truth. They say it is impossible to distinguish between truth, rhetoric, and propaganda. They see truth claims merely as power plays by those whose interests they serve. They argue it is impossible to separate truth from power, and so there is no real possibility of any absolute uncorrupted truth. Truth claims are seen as a form of terrorism that justify the powerful and silence those who disagree. Relativism. It leads to egocentrism. It's all about you, right? If your voice is just as important as my voice, and I want to sell you something, then I need to focus on you. It leads to consumerism, right? It's about selling you things. Descartes said, I think, therefore I exist. Postmodernism says, I feel, therefore I exist. And as you said, advertisers realized this decades ago, that it's about making you feel good about their product, not know good about their product. So that when you make your choices, you're acting on feelings. The greatest evil is boredom. The greatest evil is, I'm not being entertained right now. This isn't helping me become a better person or making me feel good, and because I'm all that matters, obviously there's something wrong with the situation. And what's the solution? The solution is therapy. And it's interesting how many of our churches have become more like therapy centers, right? It's not about the fact that you're sinful, it's about the fact that you have an illness. And let me sell you something, give you something, put you through counseling to treat your illness, and then you won't have it anymore. And if I can't treat it, then obviously it's not an illness and it's okay, right? If obviously your moral failing is not growing out of some sort of pathology, then it's not actually a moral failing, it must be okay. And there's a couple of themes that arise out of this. One is the myth of apocalypse, right? Which is interesting. It's a myth that's in our culture and also in our churches. That what's going to save us all? Well, it's not absolute rational knowledge. The world's going to hell in a handbasket. It's about you, right? So hence all the disaster flicks where everybody dies except the hero. And the point is everybody gets to see themselves as the hero. Whenever I see ads for those movies, I think, man, I've never been the hero anywhere, so I'm the guy that dies like 4 minutes into the movie. I don't really want that. All right, if any of you who watch Star Trek, I'm the guy in the red uniform. You know, as they're beaming down, you're like, don't go, you will die. And they always do, right? Kirk comes back, but the character that you've not met before won't survive the episode. But this, again, if there's no absolute truth, if we're not striving for anything, if it's all about you, and there's no hope out there, then it's about you surviving the disaster that's occurring out there. And let me tell you something that will help you get through that. And also the sense of the end of history. We're not working towards anything particularly. History is just a random sequence of events in which powerful people attempted to exert power over others. And that's where we're going. So why bother even studying it? And certainly why bother trying to create it? And that is postmodernity. And I'm going to spend some time tomorrow morning critiquing that a little bit. So I'm not going to
you're not going to critique it?
Well, we will. It depends on where the rest of this goes. Next slide, Stephen.
So, but you guys got that, so how postmodernity grew out of modernity. In many ways, modernity gone to seed, all right? And the 3 ways you will encounter postmodernity in your classrooms, all right, are 3 expressions of it that you'll always see. Relativism, all right, religious pluralism, and disdain for the meta-narrative, all right? Do you guys know what that means, right?
A big overarching story,
all right.
Claim to truth.
Postmodernism very much into your story, my story, but as soon as you start talking about a big story that explains, do you guys know, what does it mean, do you guys know what it means when cancer has become metastatic? What does it mean? What does static mean? Not moving, right? Meta means beyond, right? So beyond static, the overarching, a global expression of the story, okay? Those are the 3 ways you'll encounter postmodernity. Should I?
We should get into the next question.
All right.
Running out of time.
All right, boy. All right, well, you know what? Let's answer this now. I did want to give you guys some armamentarium to speak with your atheist friends.
So why don't we get to our last 2 questions?
Yeah, let's do that first.
So how do we love God with our mind? In 3 minutes.
Come on, Dan, you had more quotes than me. No, I'm just kidding, Dan. I'm just kidding. All right, and I want to, before I go on, I want to, some of my heroes in terms of this stuff are writers like Os Guinness and J.P. Moreland and Ravi Zacharias and those guys. You know what I mean? If you haven't read those guys, I definitely think you should do. Like a lot of these concepts just simply come from their work. All right, I like to say they're mine, but they're
and read
not.
all their stuff before you bother reading any Dawkins or
exactly.
And speaking as a surgeon who gets through about 3 books a year, I'm never going to bother reading any of that stuff because I'm far more interested in loving God with my mind and building a Christian worldview than I am in attempting to understand them.
And then it'll help you critique things it's like, so let me see, there's no such thing as truth, but are you saying it's true that there's no such thing as truth? You know what I mean? Like
if it's
stuff,
true for you.
Right, stuff like that, right? You'll see how certain arguments are self-refuting, like, my brother is an only child, or I don't speak a word of English. Those things can't be true because I've violated them by presenting you with the arguments. So we'll talk about those later. But anyhow, so loving God with your mind. In doing this, in trying to figure out how to explain this, I listened to J.P. Moreland talk about, he was doing some research into a German philosopher, last name of Husserl, all right? And he was, like Dan was saying, he sort of lived after he did a lot of his writing after the First World War and before the Second World War. So he saw sort of the horror of World War I and the rise of Nazism. And what he tried to do was try to understand how that happened. Like how could, like Dan was saying, arguably the most educated civilization that the world had ever known, that is the German people at that time, brought such horrors onto the world, all right? And here's what he found, and I thought it was really quite insightful, all right? He was seeing that in Germany, especially in the academic areas, a concept of knowledge was beginning to emerge. And that was that it was what was called the empiric understanding of knowledge. You guys ever heard of that term? Do you guys ever heard this expression? Dr. Chandra diagnosed and treated the pneumonia empirically. Do you know what that means? Okay, here's what it means. Empiric knowledge is knowledge that you gain from the 5 senses, okay? So for example, if I see somebody come into my office or into the emergency, they look sick, and I listen to their chest and I hear crackles, I feel them and they're hot, Do you see what I mean? I'm using my 5 senses, and I'm going to diagnose with pneumonia, and I'm going to treat it empirically. Do you see it? So now you understand what that means. No X-ray, no blood work. That's not empiric. Do you see what I mean? So it was the empiric understanding of knowledge. And that was things that you can know are only the things that you can feel with the 5 senses. All right? And what goes along with that, as well as empiricism, is scientism, which was the only truth that you can know is truth that you can gain from the scientific method. All right? Now, do you guys see the problem with that? Science is really good at telling us some things, but it's absolutely horrible at telling us other things. All right? For example, science can explain how my hand works, but it can't tell you whether my hand is good. Do you see what I mean? When an asteroid crashes into the moon, is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's neither, actually. Science can't tell us those. It can tell us how it happened, but it can't attribute value to it. All right? And Husserl saw that happening in Germany. David Hume said this, that sort of coalesces it. If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it to the flames then, for it contained nothing but sophistry and illusion. Question, did any of that statement, can you test that with the scientific method? No. Right? So we'll come back to that self-refuting claim later. But what Husserl said was this, is that understanding of knowledge, all right, tends to leave populations inadequately prepared to address issues of meaning and significance, all right? And to mount a vigorous moral objection to tyranny, all right? It compartmentalizes knowledge. All right? So one of the ways that I think you love God with your mind, all right, is refusing to compartmentalize knowledge. So you're not going to have all this concept of knowledge, all right, that you as doctors apply on Sunday morning, and then have a completely different concept of knowledge and the understanding of truth in the universe when you go to work on Monday. All right? So one of the key ways of how you can love God with your mind is not compartmentalizing knowledge like that, all right? And that's where CMDS comes in, right? People are, why don't I just go to Bible study at, Campus Crusade, whatever, right? And then, granted, you can. But I think it's really important that you have Bible study with people who are learning the things that you are doing, all right? Because it will make it so you don't compartmentalize knowledge. You learn how to bring your Christian ideas into the workplace with you. All right? So that's number one, how you love God with your mind. And I think it's probably the most important one that I can see, and CMDS is critical to that. So refusing to compartmentalize. Other ways, subject your mind to disciplined thinking. All right? So when an idea comes across, do what the Bible says and test it. Test it against what you know and what you know, or what you know. All right? And talk to more learned people about it. It's what I did, and it's what brought me to faith. So subject your mind to disciplined thinking. I think Jesus loved God with his mind. I really do. Like, for example, who was it, the Sadducees that came and talked to Jesus? They tried to catch him in what they call a reductio ad absurdum argument. All right? What that means is this. The Sadducees, one of the things that they really struggled with was life after death. All right? So they asked Jesus, they tried to make it sound silly so that they would win the argument. It was like, Jesus, so let's say there's a woman, and she has 5 husbands, right? And then she dies. Does that mean in heaven, you know what I mean, that they're going to have, clearly that can't be in the afterlife, so that must mean there's no afterlife. Do you see what I mean? That's a reductio ad absurdum argument, reduced to the absurd, all right? And Jesus answered that amazingly well, because he knew the Sadducees. He said, and one of the key things that the Sadducees believed in was the first 5 books of the Bible, all right? And Jesus said, have you not heard it said, all right, that I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? I am, all right? God is the great I am. He quoted them, what their cornerstones of their belief to them, all right? He used the Hebrew present continuous tense, okay, that I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all right, meaning that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob still are. Do you know what I mean? In many ways saying, that's right in your doctrinal statements, guys. Haven't you ever read your own things before? All right? So I think one of the ways that Jesus teaches us to love God with our minds is to study the culture around us, all right? And not to hide from it, okay? But to study the intellectual culture around us and be prepared to speak to it if God's honor needs to be defended, all right? So those are the three ways that I think you can love God with your mind. Number one, don't compartmentalize your mind. Give it all to God, not just the Sunday and the religious stuff, but the doctor stuff as well. Number two, don't ram crap into your mind, all right? When that's going to happen, test it first, all right? And number three is study the intellectual ideas that are prevalent around you and be prepared to speak to them, all right? Don't be scared. What's the worst thing that can happen? You have to go away and look something up, all right? And be prepared to speak to them if God's honor is challenged.
Next slide, Stephen. That brings us to the end. That actually brings us to the end of our structured time. So what I would propose, now I know some of you are like totally fired up by this. You're like Mark and I, and this has just grabbed you and wow. And so you're going to be perfectly happy to spend the next half an hour, which is the break time, sitting here engaging in discussion. And some of you we lost you half an hour ago, and what we're going to do next, which is when we're going to talk a little bit more about the love of Christ, is going to be far more engaging. And you need to go and escape for half an hour and walk around and do something physical. So I'm going to end the formal time, but Mark and I are going to hang out right here. And if you that want to have discussion, pull the chairs in a little closer. And the next half hour is break that you can do anything you want with. And then Mark's here till the end of today. Yep. And then tomorrow morning, part of what I'm going to do is talk a lot more practically about how one has the mindset of Christ as you interact in the world. So that is up and coming.
So if anybody wants to come up now, what Dan and what I would love to do is give you pointers on the whole atheist people in your class, and Dan can do the same thing for postmodern people. All right, not to categorize people. Those are the main bulk of arguments that you get from.
And it's interesting because talking about compartmentalization, maybe we'll conclude this thought. Most of your classmates are atheists in their doctor's office. So when it comes to how do you treat patients, how do you make them better, they're totally into the modern view of the world. And then when you get them talking about culture, morality, ethics, religion, they're postmodern. And they're good with that duality because they've compartmentalized. And it's interesting, the Christians I interact with are often modern when it comes to morality and ethics, but a little bit postmodern when it comes to everything else, and live with those realities. And as we'll argue tomorrow morning, neither modernity nor postmodernity are Christian.
Right. And you'll find that, just to split hairs even further, you'll find a lot of people are sort of relativistic for certain things, but not relativistic about the things that really, really mean stuff to them. Do you know what I mean? Like they love to talk the value of relativistic morality, but go and try and steal their stereo or something like that. All right? We'll see where they really stand on what's true for you and not true for me.
Yeah.
Right?
Great. We're back together at 11:15. Yeah. And